Okay, we're live, and hopefully the microphone is working. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed, everything is working. My daughter is laughing at me. Um, so welcome everybody. Hopefully, a couple more people joining soon. So this is another history time, Irish history time, discussing um, discussing Irish history. And feel free to join in on the chat and to ask any questions. Um, Hi, Dennis. Thanks for joining. Hope you can hear me. If the sound is working okay, please let me know. Um, so, just a little housekeeping. Oh, great. That's good to know that actually people can hear me because it's very funny sitting in front of a computer talking to a microphone and not knowing whether people can hear you or not. So we'll start with a little housekeeping. So this will be my live stream for this week. Next week, next Tuesday, I'll do the usual history time. And then on Wednesday evening, I will be giving a talk as part of the Skellig Coast Archaeology Festival. I am going to see can I live stream that. The problem is I'll be giving the talk, so I won't be able to monitor it. Hopefully, it'll work. It may be a bit chaotic, but hopefully, it'll work. Um, I'm also hoping that at the weekend, my next long video will be out. That'll be on workhouses and the Irish famine. I'm writing now, so let's fingers crossed it'll work. Hi, Kat. Nice to see you here. So hopefully that'll be out at the week, but it may turn into a two-parter. And then my next video should be on Inishfallen, which I finally had the privilege to visit about a few weeks ago. So hopefully that will be out then. And then there won't be a video, or not a video, there won't be a live stream with Irish medieval history and clans and dynasties for 3 weeks. Hi, Paul. Ihoa. I'm doing well, Kat. Getting over a bit of a cold, but I'm okay. There won't be a live stream with two other lads for this week or next week, because next week I'll be giving a talk on the same date, and tonight or Wednesday night, one of them can't make it. So let's get going with questions. The first one is I have put out a couple of shorts recently. Uh, hi, Emperor of Cork. You didn't miss anything. I was just talking some housekeeping stuff, some live streams over the next couple of weeks. I'll come back to them at the end. So I'm launching into the first question, and anyone who's listening, please feel free to ask questions. So I've put out some shorts recently about Irish Bronze Age objects, artifacts that were in the National Museum in Dublin, Kildare Street, and a lot of people have insisted with me that these were Egyptian or Egyptian influenced. So I wanted to talk first of all today about the influence of Egypt on Ireland in two areas in particular. I should say the supposed influence. One in the Bronze Age, and the second, shall we say, in the Gaelic period, Iron Age Gaelic period. So I put out a video of some torques and collars, beautiful material that's in Dublin, and people began to insist that these are Egyptian, and they say people were saying, oh, they're so similar to any Egyptian ones. I went online, I couldn't find any. I found there's a couple of things, especially to do with what they found in Tutankhamun's. I was about to say cave, but not cave, pyramid, tomb. Um, about some of the stuff that was found there. There is um, there is some similarity, but not much. And the thing is, this was the Bronze Age. Bronze Ireland was exporting, if you can use that word, Irish bronze, especially from Killarney and other parts of the southwest, was being transported to Britain and probably the continent to to in large enough material, in large enough quantities that they have found and identified it in Britain. Um, because if you mix bronze and tin, sorry, if you not Irish bronze, Irish copper. If you mix copper and tin, you get bronze. The Egyptians used large amount of bronze, uh, but they didn't get copper from Ireland, nor did they get tin. Some people insisted that Irish tin, that Ireland exported tin to Egypt, which is a bit crazy, shall we say. There is a possibility that in the northeast of Ireland, in the Mourne Mountains, in the Bronze Age, there may have been some tin mined. But on the other hand, like most of the tin in Ireland would have come from the mines in Cornwall, which were huge, and they would have exported to many places, but probably not to Egypt because, first of all, or not directly to Egypt, because you can talk about Egypt and Ireland being influenced, but uh, the Egyptians were not really ocean going as such. Their empire was a land empire, a land and river empire. This the In the ocean going, then you had Crete, you had the Minoans, you had the Sea Peoples, whoever they may be. You had various civilizations around the Levant, what is now Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Syria. You like the Phoenicians emerged there, but uh, at this stage, say we're talking 1000 BC, 1100 BC, 1200 BC. I don't think the Phoenicians as such had emerged. Um, so you had a huge network in the Mediterranean of trade. In fact, they found a ship. I think it was going to Egypt. I think they found it off Crete, and it had a huge amount of bronze and quite an amount of tin. Enough, I think it was like 10 tons of bronze. Sorry, 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of bronze, which makes something like 10 tons of bronze. So they found a lot of material. So there was a lot of coming and going, but not with Ireland. Ireland was very, very distant from this Mediterranean network. And then around 1100 BC, you have what is called the Bronze Age collapse, whereby the Hittites collapsed, in Crete, the Minoan civilization collapsed, um, Egypt almost collapsed. A lot of the cities in the Levant collapsed as well. Egypt survives this period, but it's very, very weak. Hi, Kira. Um, Egypt survives this period, but it's very, very weak. And then in 300 and something, Egypt itself gets conquered by Alexander. Before Alexander, I think about 200 years, maybe 100 years before Alexander, it's conquered by the Persians. So there is no real connection between Bronze Age Ireland and Egypt. And then what most people say is, or what they really love, is the Tale of Scotia. The Tale of Scotia, it's a beautiful tale, but it's a medieval concoction. It doesn't even appear in the earliest versions of Laura Gabola. It's based an attempt by the medieval monks to give Ireland. Thank you, Kira. Thanks for that. I need all the support and all the liking I can get. Thank you very much. Queen Scotia was an attempt by medieval monks to give Ireland a classical or a biblical origin story. The Tale of Scotia is modeled more or less on Moses. And then, but some people don't see it that way. They insist that it's true. But if you do a bit of research, the Egyptian queens, Egyptian pharaohs, and some of the pharaohs were actually women, and Egyptian princesses were not given away in marriage to foreigners because they were considered to be almost gods, almost goddesses, and not people given away to foreigners. In fact, there is series of a couple of letters which are kind of funny from a king from somewhere in the Middle East region, where he's asking for an Egyptian princess to be married, and he's refused, and he's insisting a bit, but he doesn't get it. So Scotia is a complete and utter invention. And then probably at the time when the Gaelic people emerged in Ireland, that's probably the when the Persians had already moved into Egypt. So although it's a lovely tale and it's an interesting tale, it is false. But I just am a bit puzzled why people are so attached to it. Why some people insist against so much evidence that this is true, whether it's Queen Scotia or whether it's Irish gold from the Bronze Age being Egyptian. Some people are really, really attached to to those legends, and I don't understand why. I think Irish mythology is very, very interesting. I think it's beautiful. It has a very good depth, and it's mad in many ways because there's different versions. And the more you read about it, the more people that turn up, the more figures that turn up. But what about the pharaoh buried in Tyrone, based on local lore? I never heard of that. But like I was doing some reading about it, and I've also had people insisting on this that, for example, the prophet Jeremiah is said to have come to Ireland. Again, this seems to be a 20th century or possibly 19th century invention. Some people insist that, I think it's Loch Crew, there is a fairly amazing stone on the tomb there with lots of stone carvings, lots of beautiful stone carvings. Um, Many people insist that this has got to do with the prophet Jeremiah. Um, Other people insist that the Leah Fall, which is it's a standing stone in Tara, it's now by the Mound of the Hostages. It wasn't originally, but many people insist that that is put there biblically as well. And in fact, at the end of the 19th century, there's a group. They still exist, the British Israelites. If you Google them, you can find a Wikipedia about them. They insist that somehow or other the British or maybe the English are really an Israeli tribe, one of the tribes of Israel. Other people have insisted that the Irish were. I think the tribe of Dan. So it's, I think, I don't know, this pseudo history is a bit bizarre and it goes a bit over my head. I like reading about it, but it's interesting, but it's really made up. Emperor of Cork, you asked an interesting question there. What is your view on the rewriting of Irish history in the current political climate? History is always rewritten. It's always being rewritten. Like if you go back 100, say go back to the 19th century, and open a history book there, what they would say about Gaelic Ireland, about ancient Ireland, would, if they were written from a very British, a traditional Whig version of history, would be that the Irish were just barbarians, they were savages, they knew nothing. We civilized them. Whereas if it was, say, from the 1890s, and was from a more nationalistic or patriotic version, it would have been something like, the Irish were the best Christians, they were perfect, they were all educated, they reconverted all of Europe to Christianity, and then the Vikings came, and then Brian Boru defeated the Vikings, etc., etc. Whereas if you go back to, like, if you get documents from 1,000 years ago, if you can, you'll find various different interpretations, like from the medieval period until, say, the 17th or 18th century, people, whether they're English, Scottish, Irish, they always interpreted their own their own history in the basis of providentialism. So if something went really bad, it was because, oh, we were sinners and God is punishing us. So in 1598, there was an English plantation in Munster, and uh, less than 1,000 Irish went on a raid into Munster, and the plantation collapsed. Probably a couple of days before the Irish reached them, basically the English planters bolted, and they ran back to Cork, and some even went back to England. And then they start writing and saying, "Oh, the Irish, we're being punished by God, etc., etc." None of them would acknowledge that they fled like cowards, that they fled before the Irish arrived. But no, they all were saying it was an act of God that the Irish managed to do this. They would never say that the Irish were skilled. It was all come down to God. Then, like 19th century already mentioned, but for example, 1966, the interpretation of 1916 and the War of Independence was completely different than it is now. It was very much a patriotic view. Um, you had some historians, academic historians in Ireland, who had been trained in Cambridge and Oxford, and they were producing a more rigid history. It's a history, it has some good points. I find it a bit dry, and I find it over empirical and a bit too constricted in many ways by over empiricism. So you're not supposed to put in your own views and stuff like that. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, you had fights between revisionists and anti-revisionists. So Irish history, especially anything to do with fighting English, fighting British, or with Northern Ireland, changed a lot, and like it can get very politicized. You had a famous book. It was an American author who studied West Cork, I think it was, in the War of Independence. Um, this was in the 1990s, and he kind of insisted that there were a lot of sectarian murders in the War of Independence. Dennis probably knows the area better than me. I can't remember, but and like he wrote this book, and it ended up in the middle of Irish culture wars as such. But then it turned out that this guy's history, his research was a bit complicated. These murders, assassinations, executions happened. What you call them depends on your own point of view, but how they're interpreted changes a lot. So I think history is always rewritten, and if history wasn't rewritten, it would get very boring and very staid. Like I can remember, I always loved history, but I hated history for the Leaving Cert because it was basically 19th century European, a bit of 20th century, and the same for Ireland. Ireland was more 19th century and up to the Civil War. After that, it stopped. But I didn't like the way it was taught at all. I hated Leaving Cert history. Um, um, Emperor, can you remember the name of the guy? I'm picturing the book. I can't remember the name of the guy or the title. It created a lot of noise, and I've read lots of stuff about it. I haven't read the book, but I've read lots of articles about it. So history changes the whole time. It has to change, and I like reading history from different points of view. Like I just find funny sometimes. Like my specialty is Elizabethan history, 9 Years' War, but there's a book that's often sold in tourist bookshops by what's it called? It's called Elizabeth's Irish Wars. It's by a historian who was very pro-British. I think he was from Northern Ireland, whose name escapes me. And I think, in terms of history, it's terrible. It has some interesting facts, but his interpretation of Elizabethan period is very imperialistic. He's not sympathetic to the Gaelic Irish at all, and his view is completely blinkered. He was actually an officer, I think, in the Second World War, but in the British Army. And you can see that his stuff, it's sold as a good general history, but it's not. It's extremely biased. In a way, all history is biased, though some is less biased. So, um, to sum up, I think history has to be rewritten. Like, you could say the revisionists in the 1980s, they had some good points, but then other historians began to criticize them in the 1990s, and they had good points. Um, like Brendan Bradshaw is a historian of Elizabethan period I like a lot. He's very nationalistic, but he knows his stuff, and he was a priest. I think he died a few years ago. He was a priest, but he did a PhD in either Oxford or Cambridge. So he was trained in the very, shall we say, British method of doing history. And he knew his stuff. I didn't agree with everything he said, but I thought it was very well written and very well argued. And he was making his point. Yes, Dennis, that's it. Peter Hart. Is it something about Cork and its enemies, the War of Independence and its enemies, something like that? Sort of. Again, Peter Hart's book, although it is very criticized and rightly criticized, as far as I understand, is actually history in itself. It made history for, shall we say, the wrong reasons. The guy did a study of West Cork, of certain events in the War of Independence, and interpreted them a bit controversially. Then he got pushed by certain people, and then it turned out that his stuff was very limited. So it became historic, but not the reasons you want your history book to become historic. And Emperor, you're saying his damage is still felt in West Cork. I know that there was a woman who recently published a book. I think she comes from a Protestant family in West Cork, but she's written about the same sort of period, and it seems much more interesting. Much more interesting. Darwin and his damage on Ireland. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. Okay, so I'll move on to the next one. Wayne, how much did the different Irish tuas and provinces fight each other in the day? The answer to that is, how long is a piece of string? They fought a lot. Like, there would have been incessant raiding on each other, sort of from one tua, one province, one king against another, to, in part for revenge. If this guy burned a village that was supposedly under your protection, you'd have to, tit for tat, go and burn one of his. If there was more general, if you were supporting a certain person for kingship, you might have to follow his orders and attack someone else. So there was a lot of fighting between the different kingdoms. But this was made much worse by the succession system in Ireland, in that in most places, when King such and such or Lord such and such died, there are a large amount of candidates to replace him. Quite often, they start fighting with each other. So if you look at the O'Neills in Tyrone, in the sort of the 12th century, Canon Owen, before the O'Neills really emerged, the dominant family was the McLaughlins. And then around 1260, a little before 1260, there's a huge battle between the McLaughlins and the O'Neills. I think it's a battle of Camergan. In this, the McLaughlins get wiped out and many of them get killed by the O'Neills. The O'Neills then become dominant. But then within 50 years, like, the O'Neills start branching out and start fighting among themselves. So if you read the medieval history of the medieval O'Neill lordship, is basically one lord being supported by the English. He gets pushed out by another guy, then he pushes the other guy out. So it's a non-stop civil war, especially between cousins, sometimes between brothers. Con Babcock O'Neill, he's made the first Earl of Tyrone by Henry VIII. Now, his appointed successor was his son Matthew, O'Neill's father. Another of his sons, Shane, gets annoyed with this and starts a war against Matthew's family. Matthew is killed. Matthew's eldest son is killed by Turlough Linnock, actually. Hugh O'Neill is driven out, but then Turlough Linnock, Shane starts fighting with the MacDonalds. He beats the MacDonalds. Then he starts fighting with the O'Donnells, beats them at first, but then is beaten by them. Then he gets killed by the MacDonalds. Then Turlough Linnock comes. Hugh O'Neill then is made Taoiseach to Turlough Linnock, and then Turlough Linnock and O'Neill start fighting. Eventually O'Neill triumphs, and he starts exerting his overlordship, and he really has it out for the sons of Shane O'Neill, the MacShanes. And I think he has one or two of them hung, others arrested. So there is a lot of fighting. But if you look at the history of medieval England, medieval Scotland, medieval France, you'll find often similar levels. It took a long time. It's only really with the Renaissance that the king begins to have a kind of impersonal state, and that the lords begin to accept this state. But again, in France, that really only happens at the end of the 16th century, and then there's a big uprising of lords, the Fronde, in the 1640s, I think. So this sort of infighting and fighting and raiding was very common all over Europe. Wayne, just in relation to the McCarthys were almost, especially McCarthy Moore, they were one of the few, if not the only one, that managed to have primogeniture. In other words, for a period of like 200, 250 years, the eldest son, or one son, because we don't always know how many sons there were, inherited the McCarthy Moore lordship directly. So there was no infighting, which is very, very unique in Ireland, in Irish history. So of course, that doesn't mean the McCarthys weren't fighting with each other. Like the Battle of Callan, it's a very important battle because it was the end of the Normans pushing into kind of West Cork and more especially South Kerry. But in a way, the Normans were interfering in a war between two branches of the McCarthys. And the ones that won the battle are not the ones who would triumph in this war ultimately, because I can't remember the names, but the guy who won the battle, he gets killed outside Kinsale a while later, and then the following year his brother is killed near Mangerton Mountain in Killarney, and then the people they'd pushed aside came back. You could say that this ensured that you had fairly competent leaders, unlike, for example, one of the reasons the War of the Roses erupted in England was one of the kings, was it Henry VI, was a bit, was really, really weak. And I think, like, the stories you read about him, maybe he was suffering from depression or something like that. But he was basically just thrown in a prison and ignored, and both sides fought over the right to have the king. And then you have a war that goes on for a long, long, long time. Okay. Now, let's move on to another question. Just one second. Since we were talking about rewriting Irish history, this is it's a harder question. And it's actually the subject of my next video. Where is it gone? What caused the Irish famine? Was it genocide? Was it political? Was it a result of certain policies? Was it an example? Was it an accident? Was it just a result of the potatoes crop being destroyed? Okay, Kira, I'll come back to that question. Since I just started on the famine one, I'll continue on. The famine is really, really, really complex. I'll say it wasn't genocide, but the English, rather the British government had a huge responsibility. It was very bad luck. Um, the Before the famine, 40 or 50% of the population survived just on potatoes. Um, in 1800, Irish agriculture was, you had a lot of crop growing, huge amount of crop growing. Ireland exported a lot of cereals, sort of mainly barley and oats, to England. Irish farmers were doing very well because the price of cereals was high because of the Napoleonic Wars. Um, and you had a lot of small farms. Most of these small farms would have a couple of cattle. So they would have a good access to some dairy products. They may also have had a pig, a couple of chickens, stuff like that. Now, in the decades following the end of the Napoleonic War, the population continued to grow, and it grew especially in the West, and it began to move upland. Like in the 17th century, 18th century, I think above 120 meters, you wouldn't have had anybody living there. There's a line that's around 300 and a bit feet, 120 meters, say. Like my house is 120 meters. It's a new build. There was no houses here before because it was too high, too exposed. People weren't able to survive that. But the potato and the amount of calories it gave, and the way they had of planting it, which was a so-called lazy bed, which is something completely badly misnamed because there was nothing lazy about it because you had to physically dig a trench, put in the potatoes. If you were lucky, you would have had access to seaweed as fertilizer. Other people is Other people would use their own manure, shall we say. They put it in, then they cover it, the potatoes grow. The next year they plant the potatoes in the trench beside. Um, the population was growing, especially in the West, and most people didn't own their land, but I think 40% was in the cottier class. So basically, they're landless laborers who provided labor and were given a very small patch, I think half an acre, where they would grow their own food, which increasingly became just potatoes. If they were lucky, they would have access to some butter or to some oatmeal, which they would mix together. So they got a lot of calories from this. Um, at the same time, the road network in Ireland wasn't particularly good, especially in the west and southwest and mountain areas like Wicklow. So there was food being exported. Like where I live, the main food that would have been went to market was butter. But these new family, the farms that were getting smaller and smaller in size, they weren't producing much butter. They were producing labor as such, and the population expanded. It was totally dependent on the potato. Then the potato crop, a large part of it fails in 1845. The following year, it's not so bad, but they didn't have that much potatoes left to plant. 1847 is like a total failure. Um, and then just jumping backwards, in my mind, the main cause of the famine being so horrific was the poor law. So in 1834, the British reformed their welfare system and they invented something called the workhouse. The idea of the workhouse was its conditions were to be worse than the worst of the conditions outside. So it was based on the belief that most poor were poor because of their own fault. There were very few deserving poor. Deserving poor would be like, say, you were an orphan or a widow. Um, for deserving poor, they could go to the workhouse, but the conditions were terrible. There's a famous book by Dickens, which was made into a musical, where the kid kind of goes up, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" I can't remember the name of the name. I can't remember these names tonight. But the workhouses were horrific places. So it was based on laissez-faire, utilitarianism, anti-welfarism, you name it. Then they wanted to put it in Ireland, and they commissioned a report. And basically, the first report said, "No way, Ireland is too poor," because it was. Loads of people, such as Frederick Engels, Tocqueville, they had all come to Ireland, and they were horrified about the general poorness of the population. And this report says, "Do not bring in the poor law into Ireland." So what happened was, the British government commissioned someone else to write a report very quickly, and he said, "Bring in the poor law." So in 1838, the Irish poor law was brought in. The country is divided into poor law unions. In Kerry, you had Killarney, Carsavine, Kenmare, I think, Tralee, and then a few years later they separated Dingo. And basically, each of these unions was responsible for looking. Thank you, Wayne. That's at Oliver Twist. Each of these unions was responsible for looking after the poor in their region. So there was a tax called the rate, the poor law rate, that theoretically everyone who had a property paid. So if you were a not very rich farmer, you would have to pay to your landlord this rate. So basically, the poorest area in Ireland was responsible for looking after its own poor. This would have been difficult even in a good time. So, and then if you were then the potato crop starts failing. Initially, there were soup kitchens and some work schemes whereby if you worked, and they began to build roads in the middle of nowhere. Some were useful, some just were stupid. But they made these people who were starving work, which was difficult. In a famine, I think everywhere, the cost of food goes up. So the price of food went up. Farmers, like say in the Midlands, who would normally employ people to do labor, they couldn't afford to employ people. So there's much less work about. Poverty shot up. Food began to get really expensive. Some mid-sized farmers were dependent on selling their food, otherwise they would have starved as well. It's a whole nightmare. Then I think in 1846 there is an election, and the British government changes. The Liberal Party comes in, and while in the second half of the 19th century the Liberal Party was very favourable in many ways to Ireland, like bringing in Land Acts, at this stage the Liberal Party was very laissez-faire. The government should do nothing, Ireland should pay. And there was this belief that the Irish were lazy. The Irish landlords were responsible for everything. So you have all these different things coming together. And the result is that the workhouse system collapses because there are, like the workhouse, say in Carsavine, I think was supposed to have 500 people. It had at least 1,000. People were clamoring to get in because that was the only way they could get aid. Then some amendment was passed saying that if your land was above a certain size, you had to give up the land to go in. And then if you're faced with giving up land or starving, people gave up the land. So things got worse and worse. And after 3 or 4 years of near starvation, total starvation, people's physical status was terrible. So this was the main killers, especially in the second half of the famine, typhus and stuff like that. Probably the cold killed people, the flu killed people. Sort of people had no immunity. They were dying a lot. So that's a very quick overview of a complicated topic. So I would say the famine wasn't genocide, but the British government policy made it much, much worse than it could have been. Like if they had kept with soup kitchens, if they had maybe even if they had closed down the ports, if they had brought food in, if they had spent more money, um, things could have been a lot less bad. They could have been less bad. I'm in the middle of writing about this at the moment, so I don't want to say much more. Now, Kira, what were you asking? Okay, what are the general rules of war? What happened to the women and children? In most wars, um, most raids, they were very small scale. So I would say there weren't many civilian casualties. Um, in part because raids are noisy, so people would get out of the way, and people would know not to they would know to run away. There was a law passed. Well, it was a law passed written by the church, a church synod in like I think the 8th or 9th century, the Law of the Innocents, which is probably one of the first laws which says in Western Europe, which specifically says that non-combatants should not be killed or injured when you're fighting with each other. Okay, if lads, if Lord such and such and his cousin want to fight to be McCarthy, fine, but it is a sin, it is a crime if you kill people doing that. Um, at times, at certain times, like coming up to the Normans, etc., where fighting seems to have been pretty bitter, you see a lot of churches getting burned, whether by Vikings, whether by Irish, and then by Normans. And then, so I imagine in some fights, people got killed. The Normans seem to have butchered a lot of people at the beginning. However, when things got really, really bad under the Tudors, especially under Elizabeth, um, in part that was because the the Gaelic Irish the Reformation had come in. The Gaelic Irish had always been seen as somehow savage, non-European, non-Christian, and the fact that they remained papists, remained Catholics, moved them beyond the pale. Especially as the 16th century goes on and Puritanism gets stronger. There are a huge amount of massacres under Elizabeth. In fact, the Chichester, who later becomes Lord Deputy and basically founds Belfast, he boasts about killing people. He says you have to kill all the Gaelic Irish. Brendan Bradshaw says that there were two ways, like the Old English and the Elizabethan English. They were discussing a lot about how to convert, how to reform the Irish, by the pen or by the sword. And by the end of the 16th century, reforming by the sword had won out. So, and then they began to believe that the quickest way to end the war was by famine, and to have famine as well as cutting down crops, you killed everybody. So, a lot of people were butchered. Um, in my opinion, Elizabeth is much worse than Cromwell. Cromwell's period, in Cromwell's period, a lot of more people probably died, but in a way that's because of famine, etc. Because you had armies marching all over Ireland for 10 years. And in that early modern period, wherever an army went, disease followed, famine followed, because the army basically stole food to survive. And when you had armies marching up and down, the food got stolen, crops got burned, then crops didn't get planted. So, but the Elizabeth people killed a lot more people directly. Directly. Now, how Cork got its rebel name from the War of the Roses. Okay, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I never knew why Cork was called the Rebel County, especially because you know Cork. Most of Cork wasn't involved in 1798, and in fact, there is. I don't know how true it is. there is this story that in Wexford in 1798, the rebels they defeated some English force, and some of this English force were soldiers from I presume West Cork. They were Irish speakers, and many of them couldn't speak English. Whereas the people fighting in Wexford in 1798 were English speakers and they didn't understand Irish. So many of the English, well, the Irish who were fighting for the English, they were killed because they were asking to surrender, asking for mercy, but the other side couldn't understand them. I don't know how true that is. Knox of Clune had a battle in 1798. I know there was one small battle in 1798, but it's I always find it strange why Munster is largely missing from 1798. Like you had Wexford, large amounts of Kildare that's fighting, parts of Northern Ireland, Antrim, etc. And then you had the French landing in Ballina, in Killala, sorry, and then the races of Ballina, and then the final defeat in Longford. But Munster is more peaceful. Um, yeah, I remember getting mentioned. Munster is more peaceful, whereas 2 years before, you have the fleet in Bantry that gets as far as Bantry in 1796, but cannot land. And if that fleet had landed, I imagine that the following history may have been very, very different. Because if 10,000, 20,000 French soldiers had landed in Ireland, the English would have had to divert a huge amount of men here because they didn't have much. Um, so, and Napoleon was still, he was a rising figure at the time. And actually, I saw a book once written by, I think it was an Irish guy who was his doctor in Santa Helena. And he said that Napoleon said to him, if I'd gone to Ireland instead of Egypt in 1798, things would have been very differently. Because Napoleon famously chose to go to Egypt, where he came a cropper eventually, and abandoned his army and came back. The only good thing that seems to come out was the Rosetta Stone. And he seems to have felt in his final days um, that he made a mistake. He wasn't much for admitting his mistakes. So I don't know how true that one is. I don't know how true that one is. Um, no, just one more second. Another question. Okay, sorry, just some of your comments. There have been so many comments, I haven't been able to keep up with them. A big discussion about Cork. Emperor of Cork, 1991 book by Michael Darry called Mythic Ireland. The Sun People. I haven't heard of that. I must have a look for that. And then Paul, the Heritage Centre in Skibbereen has a detailed and harrowing permanent exhibition covering the famine in the area. Yeah, it's strange how certain parts, like most of Galway and Mayo, and I think parts of Donegal were the worst hit. And then after that, Kerry, like parts were very bad, but not as bad as more to the north. But certain parts of Cork were really really awful. Um, and I always wonder why, especially Skibbereen. Maybe it's got to do with farming, the farming structure there. Because something else that about the famine is that people always ask why didn't they get fish? Is because it went on so long. Many fishermen, first of all, they only had very small boats. Secondly, many of them they sold their nets in the first year, or maybe even the second year, believing that things were going to get better, whereas they got worse. They sold to buy food, as many people did. But then it went on for a total of like 7 years. So they sold their means of catching fish to buy food. And also, many of the shoals of fish, like especially herring, and I think, not sure about mackerel, they have a tendency to move into the coast and out of the coast at different times. And they moved away from the coast a few years before. So that made it harder to for them to fish, because most of them would have like currach type boat. So they would be restricted to quite a bit inland. And second, there was also a lot of fishing rights, especially inland. Um, like in Northern Ireland, the River Bann above above Lough Neagh, it ha Lough Neagh at the moment is a disaster, but the River Bann was really, really, really important for eel fishing. But I don't know which lord, but Lord such and such had the rights for eel fishing. Um, and then there was, and he got them, or his great great grandfather got them in the 17th century. And there was a famous court case in the early 20th century over them. Um, and I know down in Kenmare, the people talk of the Kenmare River. The Kenmare River is not a river. The Kenmare River is a bay. It's between Beara and it's between Ivra. But Lord Kenmare called it a river, so he would have the fishing rights there. Emperor, yeah, the charge for seaweed, fees for fishing. They didn't always charge for seaweed. Quite often, local people had rights to seaweed. Like my mother grew up in Glenbeigh. In Glenbeigh, the main beach is Ross Bay, but there's a back beach there where she would, when she was a kid, she was born in 1938, she would often go to pick up the seaweed, and it was really well known for seaweed. Um, but seaweed and then picking like shells, like mussel, not maybe mussels or periwinkles. Some people would have rights. Maybe they were traditional rights over the seaweed. I think the Irish coast, especially in the south, southwest, is so ragged. There's so many little inlets, so many places to get seaweed. It's hard to control it. But I know that like there are recipes for seaweed, etc. But when everything else is going, when there's no other food, you won't be able to survive on that. The crown's still on the seabed. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Um, we're almost out of time. Let's see. Just one more question. What if Ireland had joined World War II on the Allied side? Because there was a very famous offer by Churchill, I think it was 1940, maybe 41, saying that if Ireland joined on the British side, they would get the six counties and Ireland would be unified. De Valera refused that basically because he didn't trust Churchill, and but some people say that that was a mistake. Say he had done it, what do you think would have been the result? Um, First of all, I think Ireland would have had difficulty getting food. Okay, would have had enough food to survive, but anything that came inland, that came by sea, which was already difficult. My uncle, he was born in 1929, and he was like a teenager in 1945, and he remembers seeing his first bananas. He's walking through Dublin, and he sees a crowd in front of a shop window, and he goes to see what they're looking at. They're looking at bananas because there had been no bananas arriving for 6 years. The same with tea. Oil would have been very difficult. Ireland was neutral during the Second World War, but it was very much a pro-Allied neutrality. Like there's a famous case. There was a woman working in, I think, Blacksod Bay in the Met station there, and it was her weather forecast that got the go ahead for D-Day, because D-Day, it had been delayed, and then all the British Met people were saying, no, no, the weather is bad. When this lady sends her forecast from the Irish West Coast, and it said there's good weather coming. There's a spot of good weather coming. And apparently Eisenhower got that, and he said, let's go. And she was correct, and they managed to land. I won't say land safely, but they landed the biggest invasion, beach invasion in history, I think. Ireland played a role in that. British pilots, when they shot down, were basically brought to Dún Laoghaire and put on the boat or sent over the border, whereas the German ones were interned. So it was a very benevolent neutrality. A lot of people say that De Valera signed a book of condolence for Hitler, which is actually wrong. He didn't. The English twisted it, especially Churchill began to twist that at that time. But basically, De Valera, he went to the house of the German ambassador. His name was, or minister, I think they called him, to offer him asylum if he wanted. Because De Valera got on well with the German ambassador, whereas the American ambassador seems to have hated De Valera and was not a particularly nice guy. And I think something like 100,000 soldiers from the South fought in the war, on lots on the English side, a lot more on the American side as well. Would Ireland have been able to do anything more? I think it was the amount of manpower was very high. Whereas if we'd joined the war, we'd probably been open to getting bombed by the Germans, at least for a couple of years before the Germans got pushed back. The main thing, I think why Churchill wanted Ireland to join was the ports, because until 1936, Dún Laoghaire, Castletownbere, and Cove were held by the English Navy, and then they were handed over in 1936. So Castletownbere and Cove are basically on the Atlantic. They're on their big ports. So it meant that the English Navy ships, the convoys crossing, could have stopped there. It would have made some difference, but would Northern Ireland have been handed over to the South? I don't like De Valera, but I have a feeling he was correct in being suspicious here. I don't think it would have happened. Churchill did not like De Valera, did not like Irish people or Southern Irish people. Like you can see that in the speeches. He made a famous speech at the end of the war where he had a huge go at De Valera in Ireland, and then De Valera made a reply, which I think was much better. So I think that would have, like, I think Ireland was better to do what it did rather than to take part in the fighting itself. Okay, I'm almost an hour, so I'll just wrap up by going through a bit of housekeeping. There won't be this week or next week. There won't be the live stream with the guys from Irish Medieval History or Clans and Dynasties. Next Tuesday I'll do another of these, and then on Wednesday I'm giving a talk as part of the Skellig Coast Archaeology Festival. It's about Gaelic otherworlds. I'm going to try and live stream it, but since I'll be giving the talk, if anything goes wrong, I probably won't be able to see, because I'll be giving it like it's a good old-fashioned face-to-face talk in a hall. So I'll give someone my phone and set it up. So if it goes well, it will go well. Otherwise, I don't know. I'm also hoping that over the weekend, I will release a new video on the Irish famine and workhouses. Fingers crossed. So it may turn into a double video because it's looking very big. What you mean, Emperor of Cork? What you mean by a viewer stream? I'm going to try and stream the talk, like sort of. I'm going to set up my phone as a camera, and put it transmitting my talk. So hopefully that will go for it, but I won't be able to keep an eye on it. So if you want to send a message saying what you meant by that. Thanks, Dennis. Glad you enjoyed it. Thanks, Kira. Thanks a lot. So yeah, unless anyone has anything else, we can finish now, and I will see you next Tuesday. Keep an eye out for a new video. I presume you'll get told about it by however YouTube tells people. So I'll just say good night, Slán, and I hope the weather stays reasonable. It didn't rain today, which was good. So bye bye, Slán. Bye, Emperor. Bye, Dennis. Bye, Kira. Bye, Kat. Bye, Paul. Slán.